You're listening to Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. This is episode 6. Mr. Belvedere taught me about AIDS and other lessons I learned growing up Generation X. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. I am glad you're joining me today. Let me say a couple words kind of as a preamble. I want to talk first to those people who kind of listen to me on YouTube, and then talk next to those who listen to me on podcast form. So if you, and let me just also preface with this by saying that I really don't care whichever avenue you are listening to me or watching this on. I am really just elated, absolutely elated that you have taken the time to watch this program or listen to this program. But I do want to let you know that like if you're on YouTube, don't think like you have to watch it on YouTube. Because as you can see, if you're on YouTube, that the quality isn't quite as extensive. I mean, I'm just sitting here in my bedroom, and I don't have all the fancy equipment and stuff. Eventually I will get there, but I'm just letting you know that there are other options other than just watching. So if you are interested in just listening to the podcast, you are welcome to just listen to the podcast, particularly on podcasts like this, because I'm not like showing anything or anything like that. So I am pretty much on all the major podcasting platforms. And if you want to listen to me instead of watch, this footage, you're always welcome to do that. But again, wherever you're listening, wherever you're watching, I'm just glad you're listening and watching. I don't want to dissuade you in any way from tuning in. I just want to let you know that there are more options. And you're not just limited to watching it here on YouTube. But I know that people who are on YouTube like to be on YouTube, and people who listen like to listen on podcasts. And let me just say too, now for those people who are just listening to me on iTunes or Spotify or something like that, I would encourage you though that you need to go over and subscribe to my YouTube page if you're so inclined. And the reason is that I am going to be uploading exclusive content about growing up Generation X that is just more visually appealing than it is auditory appealing. So like something like I'm doing today, you can watch it and listen, or you can just listen and listen. Really not going to make that much of a difference. But there are going to be things about growing up Generation X where it's just going to make more sense for the visual. And so there'll be exclusive video things, video footage, or video episodes, I should say. And I actually have already done one. So if you're listening to this, you need to know that I did one. I found a bunch of old VHS tapes, and I was excited. And so I did it, my first video exclusive. So if you want to see what those videotapes were and what they look like and me going through them, I would encourage you to really just go over there and to subscribe to the video format as well. But wherever you're listening, I'm glad. Now, today's episode is all about the lessons that we learned from television that we watched. And I titled it kind of one of those hook titles, like, what did you learn from television? The title was Mr. Belvedere Taught Me About AIDS. And the reason why is when I was growing up, of course, as I was growing up, TV has gone through different phases, obviously. And particularly sitcoms have gone through different phases. And there's really no this is one phase and this is the next phase, that kind of thing. There's really nothing like that. Things kind of phase in and phase out. But what was really popular when I was growing up was the moral lessons that the television shows were trying to teach you. That was a big deal. And it seemed like the issues that were around growing up in the late 70s into the 80s, and fading in the 70s, explicit in the 80s, and fading out in the 90s, were the issues of the day. Okay, it was very issue driven. Television, particularly sitcoms, but not exclusive to sitcoms, were all about the issues, and letting children know about those issues and letting families know about those issues and kind of how to handle them. Now, later they got into, it was very agenda driven. It wasn't issue driven, it was agenda driven. Into the mid to late 90s, you had very agenda driven television. And I will probably do an episode on that one of these days about the agendas that were being promulgated in the mid to late 90s. And even that's a phase in, phase out kind of a thing. But today is all about the lessons and those things which the sitcoms particularly were trying to teach us. So let's talk about some of those issues that were so relevant and so pressing during that time. Well, the very first one, obviously, is what the show is named after, and that is AIDS. And that was a huge issue in the 80s, the late 70s, the 80s, and it's even an issue today. But at the time, people didn't know as much about AIDS, and AIDS research was still in its infancy, and there were a lot of rumors going around. But lucky for you, television is going to teach you all about what the reality is of AIDS. And the show, in an episode on Mr. Belvedere, the youngest son, Wesley, has a friend who contracts AIDS. And in this episode, the friend is not allowed to go back to school because he has AIDS, and Wesley thinks that he is in trouble, that this kid's in trouble, and so he has to miss school. And like this, like an AIDS was something you possessed or something like that, like you picked up drugs or something, and then it was AIDS. But what we learned in this very special episode of Mr. Belvedere is that you don't get AIDS from just human contact, and that's what they were trying to teach you. Now, you had the Wesley, who was one of the stars of Mr. Belvedere, the character's name, and then you had his friend who was supposed to show up for a play, and his friend was supposed to play Lincoln in the play, but he doesn't show up for fear of the other children, because the other children were hostile, and the parents of the other children were flat out ignorant. That's how this is, because there was a lot of ignorance going on in the world during that time surrounding AIDS. And either rightly or wrongly, I mean, quite honestly, I remember being scared of AIDS. And I remember being scared that somebody in our school was going to have AIDS, because the government was telling us that you could only contract AIDS through, a needle or sexual contact, intravenous drug use or sexual contact. We didn't know. And of course, as things are even today, a lot of people are skeptical about what the government tells you. And so we didn't know, if the kid's at school and he gets sick and he throws up on you, if you are, in risk of getting AIDS. So this was a big deal back then. And it was an epidemic that people that they wanted to address. And so what better way to address it than in an episode of television where you have the kid who has AIDS that got it because he had to get a blood transfusion, not because of anything he did himself personally. And then you have the ignorant parents and the ignorant school children, colleagues, fellow students who are, again, hostile towards this kid just because he has AIDS. And then by the end of it, we learn that, hey, you can't get AIDS just by having the kid there, that you actually have to have, like I said, intravenous drug use or sexual contact, or, be a hemophiliac and get a blood transfusion of some kind, some tainted blood or something like that. So that was a lesson that we learned from Mr. Belvedere. And I'm sure that there were other television shows which addressed the issue. And I remember it was kind of interesting because in the television show, the person who um, finally came out and said this is how it works, because you have the young kid Wesley, who's just a kid, and the parents and Mr. Belvedere, who are trying to explain to the kid, hey, how do we tell this kid about AIDS, because of course there's an element of sex that's involved with contracting AIDS, and what do we say about this kind of a thing. And finally, it's the older daughter, or the teenage daughter, who kind of just breaks down and just spills it all out and says, hey, this is the truth about AIDS. And boy, we're all lucky that we learned about AIDS because of Mr. Belvedere, because of the show Mr. Belvedere. And in the show, the character, the daughter, the teenage daughter. But that's not the only issue. That's only one of many issues. So what are some other issues that I remember? Well, another big, huge issue was illiteracy. This was a big deal. I mean, people were like, you can't be illiterate, and you got to learn to read. And if you don't know how to read, then you need to get help right away, because there's a lot of people out there who can't read. And this was a struggle I had, because I actually have dyslexia, and I read fairly poorly. I read a lot, but I actually read fairly poorly. And reading is not my main mode. I like to listen. So I listen to audiobooks and I listen to podcasts and stuff like that. That's my main mode of learning, modality of learning, even to this day. So this was striking to me, and I was really behind in school because of reading, but because I couldn't read very well. I also didn't apply myself either. I was the typical cut up kid who skipped school and didn't really do his homework, and fairly lazy, and got away with as much as I could think I could get away with. And but one of the things that factored into that was the fact that I couldn't read, and it was very difficult for me to read. But lo and behold, guess what? It's not just children who struggle with reading. It is also adults, and young adults and older adults who struggle with reading. So all kinds of people struggle with reading, and guess what? All kinds of people can't read. And how did you learn about this? Well, you learned about it, number one, from the Facts of Life. I don't know if you remember on one episode, and this was like in the 7th season. This is kind of like, I don't know if you remember the Facts of Life, but they had to keep the ball rolling after the kids got out of school. So all the kids, it was basically about a girls' school and Mrs. Garrett and the relationship in this dorm with these girls. But eventually, all these girls graduate, and so what they do is they go and they open up this food store, kind of a not a convenience store, but a shopping store, grocery kind of store. Well, Tootie's boyfriend, who's all athletic, comes and visits. It's the only time we ever see this guy. And that's a big thing too, because it was so agenda driven. You have a person, there's no continuity. You could have a person show up and it's supposed to be somebody that they know, and everybody knows who they are, and then they're there for just that one episode, and that's it. Then they're gone after that. They're just out of it. They're just gone. But here's the deal. Here's the deal. Tootie has this boyfriend who's athletic, and he comes and visits, and Tootie and him have to restock, and they're restocking, and I'm really just recalling this. They're restocking the mustard, and he picks up the wrong mustard and he gives it to her. I was like, oh, here's some mustard, and he's like, these all look the same. I've got this mustard here. These all, what do you want? These all mustards look the same, Tootie. And then it dawns on her that he can't read. That even though he's an adult, he's never ever learned to read. But don't you worry about, and I believe his name was Mike. Don't you worry about Mike, because Mike finally admits his problem and gets the help with reading that he so desperately needs. Now, that's not the only television show that tackles the tough subject of illiteracy. You might also recall the episode of Webster, where Webster's grandfather, Credopoulos or something, I can't remember their last name, very Greek name, but Webster's grandfather is discovered not to be able to read either. In one episode, they think he has an eye problem because he's at, as I recall, he's at a restaurant, and at this restaurant he is reading a menu, and he's reading it wrong, and they think he has a reading problem. They think he has, not a reading problem, I'm sorry. They think that's the problem he does have. They think he has an eyesight problem, they're like, you need to get new glasses, and yeah, if you just get new glasses, you'd be able to. He's like, I don't have an eyesight problem. And then they're at home discussing this, and he looks over at the floor, and he says, look over there at the floor, there's a penny on the floor, or a dime or something like that. He's got really good eyesight, because that's not the problem. Guess what the problem with the grandfather is that he can't read. And then they discover that this old man, well, as a grandfather, is unable to read. And finally he admits it, and he's going to get the help he needs. So don't worry about him. He's all set. He gets the help he needs. Now, are those the only issues? Well, not at all. There are other issues as well. And one of the other issues is the issue of racism. I don't know if you remember that racism was really, really super a charged issue, as it is today. But don't you worry about racism, explaining what it is and how you should stand up for your minority ethnic friends, because Growing Pains teaches us all about racism. In one episode with Dick Van Patten hires Mike Seaver, the kid, the boy, the oldest boy, who many of the stories revolve around. He hires him at his local convenience store, but lo and behold, he doesn't want to work the graveyard shift. And so the character who owns the store, played by Van Patten, I think that's his piece. I'm blowing it here. Yeah, he goes ahead and switches his schedule for for the daytime schedule, and gives the graveyard schedule to a foreign kid. And in a private conversation, Dick Van Patten tells Mike Seaver, he tells him, hey, listen, buddy, the owner tells him, I'm just looking out for our own kind here. I hire a lot of minorities, but you and me, we're on the inside track, and I went ahead and let the foreign kid work the graveyard shift because it's more dangerous. And I went ahead and put you, another fellow white person, on the daytime shift because it's less dangerous. And so Mike, of course, you know what? I think I'm getting the name wrong. I can't remember if Mike's the name of the kid or the name of the father. But anyway, regardless, the kid comes home and he tells his parents, he says to his parents, oh, don't worry, we figured it out. He told me that this guy likes to look out for white people. Uh, and or he likes to look out for our own kind. And so he did me a solid by hooking me up, by putting me back on the day shift and letting the foreign kid run the night shift. And the father kind of explodes and says, well, this is obviously racism and you should stand up and not let this happen. And the mother's torn. The mother says, well, I do recognize that it's racism, but I don't want my kid working at 3 a.m. and having some robber come in. And so they fight in front of the kid. But don't worry, it all works out. You know why? Because the kid does the right thing and he stands up to his boss and he quits that job and he gets out of that racist environment. Now, that's not the only television show that had tackled racism either. If you remember on an episode of Family Ties, when black people move into the neighborhood with the Keatons. Now the Keatons are cool because they're hippies, and even though Alex is this supposed to be this business-minded Republican, they're not racist at all, and so they have these people over, and they're happy they've moved into the neighborhood. But lo and behold, the rest of the neighbors who are anonymous figure it out. And figure out that their property value is going down because a black family has moved into the neighborhood. And we learned that people can be very racist. Thank God for Family Ties, because we learned that people can be very racist and even go so far as to destroy their home because they want them out because they're a black family and they are bringing their property value down. But don't you worry, they all do the right thing. They stand up and they are the voice of reason. And you are very lucky that you learned about racism by watching television in the 80s. Well, are those the only? Well, by far, those aren't the only issues. You can't talk about the television shows of the 80s and even into the 90s, and we'll get into the 90s here in just a moment, without talking about drugs and Nancy Reagan's Just Say No administration to drugs. She appeared on Different Strokes, but there was also a very interesting episode where Alex is taking speed because he has to get good grades on his test. And he gets this speed from none other than Mallory, his sister, right? So she's her supplier. She's reluctant. She doesn't really want to give him the drugs, but Alex is a very charming young man and he's accustomed to getting his own way, and so she supplies him with speed, and he is just doing so well on speed. But as we all learn, dope is for dopes, and Alex crashes out. He takes too much of it. He crashes out, and he doesn't wake up for his test, and he fails his test. And of course, he flips out, and he's trying to dig through the trash can to find what's left of the speed so he can take it. But the parents have intervened, and they're there to talk some sense into him. And again, we learn the lesson that it doesn't pay to do drugs, that even though drugs might help you study for your test, they also might make you crash out and miss your test altogether. So it doesn't matter how good you studied or how well you did. If you take too much of them, eventually, or any amount of them, or you will miss your test and you'll have to have your father basically shake some sense into you so that you will learn not to do drugs, or you will learn that it doesn't pay off. And I remember Alex saying something like, "Oh, I wasn't even like me. You know, it wasn't even. I don't even. Yeah, drugs will turn you into a different person for sure. You know." And I'm saying a lot of this tongue in cheek, but of course, a lot of these lessons are, really valuable and stuff. I just think it was funny that um, they had to uh, make an episode out of it to teach us all about these things. And I guess they were worried about, our being latchkey kids, and parents not being there to teach them, and being raised in front of the television, which was, a good part and parcel of being raised Generation X. There was a large segment of society that was that way, and so they had these television shows in which you learn these lessons. Now, that's not the only one, and this actually brings us a little into the 90s as well, because as I said, there's phase in, phase out. It's not like you can just, put a date and like, this is where all the issues were learned, and this is where all the issues ended, and then television shows change. There were shows that came out that kind of demarked it and said, well, this is a show that's very antithetical to what came before, but you still had the carryover. And so some carryover into the 90s with these issues was Saved by the Bell, because Jessie, the smart girl, gets caught up in almost the same kind of thing that Alex P. Keaton gets caught up into in an episode there. What we have is that she kind of gets split into, she spreads herself too thin, basically. Jessie spreads herself too thin, and she's trying to be part of this music group and shoot music videos that Zach Morris is behind, and wants to make these girls do this so that he can make money off of them and profit off of them. And so she wants to do that because, of course, she wants to be famous and a singer, but she's also a brain, and she wants to do good in school. Well, what's the solution to all that? Well, of course, the solution to all that is take drugs, right? You take drugs. And so she gets spun out too of her mind. She's taking cross tops or whatever upper that she chooses that they gave us on the program. She takes those drugs, and she does the same thing. She has a total flip out meltdown. I can't remember if she misses her test or not, or something like that. It was really similar to the to the Family Ties episode of the Alex P. Keaton story. But instead of being shook by her father, like Alex was, she was comforted by Zach Morris, who was the person responsible for all this in the first place. So drug abuse was another issue that was highly talked about. And I even said that there was an episode where Nancy Reagan was on an episode of Different Strokes, where she was promoting her Just Say No stuff. So, I mean, her Just Say No campaign. So you could see that even then. Now that's kind of a fade out. Like, after that, some shows that really kind of changed things, away from not agenda driven, but issue driven stuff, were, I would say, Married with Children and Seinfeld were probably two shows that were just basically about funny stuff. Not really, Seinfeld, the whole joke there was it's about nothing. And Married with Children was another family show, but not really anything agenda driven. It was supposed to be the opposite of the Cosby Show. So like everything non-wholesome, kind of dysfunctional, shining a light on dysfunctional families, not functional families who learn lessons and then teach us those lessons, but a dysfunctional family that was just supposed to be a funny show. and then you, of course, later you had Friends, and then in Friends you start getting some agenda driven stuff, but you had this, this period where it was neither one. But on the front end, kind of coming into this, I remember the Brady Bunch as well, where a big deal was equality among the sexes was also another agenda that, or another issue that was being driven in the television shows. And I remember on the Brady Bunch, an older version of the Brady Bunch, which would have been, of course, prior to the 80s, was an issue, was an episode where they had like the Scouts or something like that, and she couldn't be in the Scouts. Now, I don't think it was the Boy Scouts, because I think that's a registered trademark, and so it wasn't the Boy Scouts per se that she that she was getting into, but it was some type of male scout thing, and it was one of those girls are just as good as boys kind of a thing, and so that was, and she got in, but then she never attended. That's what happened there. I remember she got in, she qualified, and she did really well on all the tests and all the stuff she had to do to get in, but then she just wanted to prove that she was good enough to be in, but she didn't want to necessarily ruin the boys' club, so she didn't actually go to any of it, but she did very much qualify to be in. Now, and that was another issue that was all throughout the 80s, and that was gender equality. And you even see this now. So far, I've really only talked about this as far as sitcoms is concerned. Let me bring one more show in that addressed this, and that's Cagney and Lacey. Cagney and Lacey was a girl cop show, but if you watch the very few first episodes of it in season 1, you'll find out that it was very much a girls are just as good as boys kind of episode as well, because what Cagney and Lacey were female cops, and they were made detectives, but because of course they're girls, the only thing that they are good for is catching Johns. So they've got to dress up as prostitutes and catch Johns. And they keep wanting to be promoted and get off the catching Johns thing, but the captain's basically like, well, you're just a bunch of girls and you're not as good as boys, and so you can't do this, and you stay there and you look like hookers, and then you can catch these guys who are trying to pay for sex. Well, in that episode, what happens is there's this gruesome murder, and it's, I guess, pretty disturbing. And even the male cops are like, oh gosh, I don't want this. And so because nobody wants it, and because these girls are clamoring that they want to be detectives, and they are detectives, but they want to be detectives and be put on the same kind of case as the boys are. The captain thinks it's a good idea to let these girls on the case to teach them a lesson, to see. And he actually even says this behind closed doors. He says, well, I'm going to go ahead and let them on this, and then they'll get so grossed out that they'll just be happy to go back dressing like prostitutes and catching the people that want to pay for sex. But although it's gruesome, what we find out is that girls are every bit as good as boys. And because they're every bit as good as boys, they solve the case, and they solve it so well that now they're not given the petty, the cases that nobody wants, but they're actually taken seriously as female detectives. And this was a theme throughout that time. I mean, when I just remember whenever there was a contest, like whenever any episode, it wouldn't matter, Family Ties, you could name them all, Different Strokes, Family Ties, Facts of Life, Growing Pains. Whenever there was a contest between the boys and the girls always won. It It was just like, okay, we're going to have a contest. And, whether it was a football game or whether it was whatever, it was always like, we're just going to push this down your throat. Girls are just as good as boys, and you've got to know that. And so the girls are going to win in every episode. Now these aren't the only things. I got a couple more that I want to go through, and I'm actually going to end, unfortunately, on a fairly serious note. That even though I'm saying this tongue in cheek, there's going to be a serious thing at the end of this. I think. I don't know. Well, we'll see how I feel about bringing the issue up. But another issue that was brought up during this time was the issue of gangs, and you shouldn't be part of gangs. Of course, you had the rise of the Crips and the Bloods, and what's a young person supposed to do when they're confronted with gangs and being part of a club and wanting to belong? What do you do? I mean, who knows? Well, luckily for you, the people over at Different Strokes know, because they had a whole episode about Willis joining the gangs. I think it was the Triantulas or something like that. But don't worry. So, this affects everybody. Gangs are on the rise, and Willis, whose adopted father is a multi-millionaire, is getting sucked into this stuff, and he has to make a decision. He goes behind his father's back, but don't worry, he learns his lesson. He learns that the Triantulas are really up to no good, and that joining gangs are for losers, and it's a deadhead place to go. You will ultimately go nowhere except to prison if you join a gang. And unfortunately, the last thing that was on the list, well, you know what? Well, I'll say it because I gave the teaser out, but was the issue of pedophilia. Yes, that was and I hate to end on such a somber note. Maybe if something comes to mind that it will, I'll say that in the end instead. But that was an issue, and of course, you had the episode in Different Strokes where you had this pervert basically showing these kids cartoons that were sexually explicit in nature, and he was this horrible, this person who was into this. And yeah, of course, we learned about that. You learned in the 80s, you learned stranger danger, 70s, 80s, and 90s. You learned stranger danger. You learned that just because somebody looks nice doesn't mean that they are nice, that they could have some very malevolent agendas. And so those are the lessons that we learned. Well, those aren't the only lessons that we learned, of course. I might even do another episode on the lessons that we learned. But yeah, I mean, maybe another lesson that's not so talked about is the seriousness of I really wasn't prepared to talk about a whole lot, was the seriousness of sex altogether. I mean, there was an episode where Alex P. Keaton has a job for one episode of being a grocery delivery boy, and he meets a seductress. And in this episode, he actually loses his virginity, a big deal. And facts of life, Natalie is the first one out of that bunch to lose it. And that was another serious episode of things that kids have to deal with. Was when is it right to lose your virginity? Talk about a heavy episode growing up. Yeah, well, they're heavy episodes. These were all issues of that time. These were all things that the TV executives thought it was best that those families and those children sitting in front of the TV should know about. Now, if there's any other things that either I mentioned and you remember an episode, please, if you're watching this on YouTube, leave it in the comments below. I'd love to read about all of it. I would love to read about all those. And if there were any other issues in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, and early 90s that I didn't bring up here, also leave that in the comments below. And don't forget, please, to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Those are 4 things. Yeah. Like it, comment, subscribe, and share. And if you didn't like this program, you can hit the thumbs up, the thumbs down button twice. If you liked it, hit the thumbs up button once, but if you didn't like it, hit the thumbs down button twice, and that will really help us out. Also, if you are so inclined and you have a little extra cash and you're tired of seeing me in my house in front of my closet, and you want to see something a little bit more professional on a regular basis, I am trying to grow the channel. That's why I want you to share this and get some of that podcast money, that YouTube money. But there's another way. We could bypass all of that. If you just got extra cash in your pocket and you're just looking for someone to share it with, I am that somebody. I have a link in the comments below to my Buy Me a Coffee, and you can donate some of that hard-earned cash to help me out down there. So thanks again for joining me on another episode of Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. We will talk to you again real soon.